Cale stood still, his eyes scanning the wreckage, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Shannara, hidden just beyond his line of sight, continued to watch him carefully, her every muscle coiled, ready to spring into action at the slightest hint of danger. Despite her wariness, something about the human soldier intrigued her. He wasn't acting like the enemy she had fought on countless battlefields. There was no aggression in his stance, no rush to take control. "I'm not here to fight you," Cale repeated, his voice firm but calm. His eyes flicked to the ground where the remains of her ship lay scattered across the barren terrain. "You're hurt. You shouldn't be out here alone." Shannara could hardly believe her ears. In a war that had pitted her people against the humans for so long, Cale's words felt like an alien concept. She had heard human soldiers mock the weak, crush those who were vulnerable without a second thought. But here was one standing in front of her, his posture open, his words surprisingly gentle. Was he lying to her? Was this some kind of trap? Her instinct screamed at her to retreat, to take cover, and yet she remained still, too curious to turn away. With calculated steps, Cale took a few more paces forward. "I know who you are," he said quietly, almost to himself. His voice softened as he continued. "You're Princess Shannara of the Valen Empire, aren't you?" The mention of her name took Shannara by surprise. She had hoped that her identity would remain a secret. Her royal bloodline was not something she intended to reveal so easily, especially to an enemy soldier. But how did he know? She had only heard whispers of human scouts and spies, but none had ever been this close. Her heart beat a little faster, but she kept her face neutral, her eyes unreadable. She would not give away anything. "What does it matter to you?" Shannara's voice was cold, a shield she quickly raised. She could not afford to show weakness, not now, not in front of this human. "You're my enemy." Cale paused, his brow furrowing slightly. The intensity in her voice was unmistakable, but there was something else there too. Uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of fear. Still, he refused to back down. "I'm not your enemy. Not anymore." He shifted his stance, allowing her to see that his weapon was lowered. Shannara's mind raced. Could this human soldier really be different from the others? Was there any truth to his words, or was this just a clever ruse to get closer to her? She weighed her options, all while never lowering her guard. She knew better than anyone that the cost of a miscalculation could be deadly. But even as she wrestled with the decision, she found herself unable to fully dismiss Cale's words. There was something in the way he looked at her, something genuine, untainted by the hatred that had defined their conflict for so long. For a brief moment, Shannara's gaze softened, though only slightly. She had to admit, she wasn't entirely sure what to make of this human. In the vast expanse of space, amidst the chaos of a war that spanned galaxies, Princess Shannara of the Valen Empire found herself stranded on a foreign planet. Her ship, a sleek and advanced vessel, had been struck by enemy fire during a covert mission. The once mighty craft now lay in ruins, scattered across the desolate land. Shannara, though a skilled warrior and strategist, felt the weight of her isolation more than ever. As the leader of her people, her strength and composure were expected to be unshakable. But today, she could feel the cracks in her resolve. She moved carefully through the wreckage, her sharp alien eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. But all she could hear was the wind howling through the broken structures of her ship. She had no weapons, no backup, and no way to communicate with her fleet. Her royal armor, once gleaming and dignified, was now dirtied and scratched, a symbol of her fall from grace. She couldn't let fear take hold. Her people were counting on her to return, and failure wasn't an option. As Shannara continued her search for a safe haven, a faint sound reached her ears. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Her body tensed in an instant. She quickly found cover, crouching behind the wreckage of her ship. Her breath was steady, her mind sharp, but her heart raced. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not one of her soldiers. He was human. Sergeant Cal Donovan. The human soldier's attire was battered, a reflection of the brutal conflict he had survived. His piercing blue eyes scanned the area cautiously, his fingers resting near his weapon. He moved with the grace of someone who had seen countless battles, yet there was a hesitance in his posture, a flicker of uncertainty. Genera studied him, unsure of what to make of the stranger. Humans were the enemy in this war, after all, and she knew their tactics all too well. Was he part of the group responsible for her ship's destruction? Or was he simply a survivor, lost in this hostile environment like her? She needed answers, but showing herself would be risky. For a long moment, the two stood in silence, each aware of the other's presence but unsure of how to act. Genera's mind raced with calculations. Should she engage him, try to overpower him, or wait for him to make the first move? Her royal instincts told her to stand tall, to demand answers, to assert her power, but something in her gut urged caution. This human, despite being her enemy, held a mystery that intrigued her, and he had yet to raise his weapon against her. In the stillness of the moment, Genera wondered, was this a soldier who followed orders, or someone capable of understanding the complexities of this war? Her thoughts were interrupted when Kale suddenly spoke, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of surprise. "I don't want to fight. I just want to understand." Genera felt her heart skip a beat, the tension in her body easing just slightly. Could it be that this human soldier was different from the others? The air between Kale and Genera was thick with uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them moved. Genera, still hidden among the wreckage of her ship, couldn't help but watch Kale with a mixture of curiosity and caution. This human soldier had said he wasn't her enemy, but could she truly believe him? He was a part of the army that had been fighting against her people for years. He had been raised to hate her, to see her people as nothing but obstacles in his way. And yet here he was, speaking to her as if she were a person, not a target. It didn't make sense. Kale, on the other hand, was still trying to process the situation. He had seen countless aliens in his career, fought them, and followed orders to the letter. But Princess Genera was different. She was no ordinary alien. Her presence was commanding, yet there was an unspoken vulnerability in her eyes that made him hesitate. He had expected her to be like the others, arrogant, ruthless, and determined to crush anyone who got in her way. But Genera didn't seem like that. She was calculating, yes, but there was something else there, something human, and it troubled Cal in a way he didn't fully understand. "I'm not here to fight," Cal repeated, his voice steady, but quieter this time, as though trying to convince both her and himself. "I just want to make sure you're safe. You shouldn't be out here alone." Genera tilted her head slightly, considering his words. She knew that humans didn't often show mercy in war, and the very idea of one offering it to her, an enemy princess, seemed impossible. Yet Cal's voice didn't carry the bitterness or aggression that usually accompany the enemy. It was softer, more genuine. She hated the way it made her feel, the small flicker of hope it stirred within her. "I don't need your help," Genera finally replied, though the words came out more harshly than she intended. She needed to keep her distance, to remind herself that this human was still her enemy. Her people's survival depended on her ability to stay strong and unwavering, no matter the circumstances. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt a pang of guilt. There was something about Kale that made her question her instincts. Cal's gaze softened, but he didn't press further. He wasn't foolish enough to push her. Instead, he lowered his weapon and slowly took a few steps backward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said, his voice calm. "But maybe we can help each other." Genera's mind raced, her sharp mind calculating all the possible outcomes. She could still see him as a threat, someone who might betray her if given the chance. But something in his eyes told her that this wasn't the typical soldier she had fought against. Kale wasn't like the others, and that realization left her wondering whether her assumptions about humans had been wrong all along. In that moment, the lines between enemy and ally blurred, and Genera found herself facing a choice she had never anticipated. Should she fight him, or trust him, just for a moment? The silence between Kale and Genera hung heavy in the air as they both stood, each weighing their next move. Genera, still hidden behind the wreckage, fought with the conflicting emotions rising within her. She had always been taught to distrust humans. They were the enemy, aggressive, ruthless, and driven by a need to conquer. Yet here she was, facing one of them in the midst of a war zone, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if her instincts were right. Kel's words hadn't been full of the usual animosity she had grown accustomed to. His calm demeanor and the genuine concern in his voice threw her off balance, and it unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Kale, meanwhile, found himself caught between duty and his growing curiosity. He had trained for years to fight against enemies like Genera, to follow orders without question. He was a soldier, loyal to his mission, committed to the cause. But something about this alien princess was different. The way she carried herself, even in the face of danger, struck him. She wasn't like the other soldiers he had fought against, cold and merciless. Genera, despite being his enemy, exuded a strength that was both admirable and puzzling. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the war had painted her to be. "I'm not like the others," Kale said after a long pause, his voice low, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "I don't want to see anyone hurt, not even you." Genera's gaze flicked over to him, studying his face carefully. Could she believe him? Could she trust him when her entire world was built on deception and war? She had seen humans lie with ease, twisting their words for personal gain. But there was something in Cal's eyes that told her he wasn't just spouting empty words. He seemed sincere, though she couldn't understand why he would risk his life to help her. She was an enemy, someone he was supposed to capture or kill, not help. "What do you expect from me?" Genera asked, her voice sharp but tinged with uncertainty. "Why would you help me, a princess of your enemy? Why not leave me to fend for myself?" Kale took a deep breath, and for the first time, he truly met her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "Maybe because you're not what I expected. Maybe because I see someone who's just as trapped by this war as I am." Genera blinked, taken aback by his answer. She had never considered that. The war had always been a one-sided affair in her mind. Her people were fighting to survive, while humans were simply trying to conquer. But Kel's words made her wonder. Was he truly trapped by the war? Or was he just using that as an excuse to ease his conscience? For a long moment, the two stood there, neither making a move. The tension in the air was thick with unspoken thoughts and possibilities. Genera could feel the heat of Kel's presence, the steady pulse of his heartbeat, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would she allow herself to trust this human soldier, or would she continue to fight against everything he represented? The answer wasn't clear, but in that moment, Genera knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be an ordinary encounter. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the wreckage of Genera's ship as she and Kale sat in an uneasy silence. The distant sounds of battle echoed faintly in the background. But for now, there was only the quiet between them. Genera's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had always been taught that survival came first, that duty to her people was above all else. Her position as a princess meant that every decision she made carried the weight of her entire empire. But Kale, this human soldier, was making her question everything she thought she knew about her enemies. For the first time in years, Genera found herself conflicted. Her instinct was to distrust him, to see him as another soldier of the enemy, someone who would gladly turn on her if it meant completing his mission. But Kale wasn't like the others. He wasn't boasting about victories or trying to belittle her as so many humans had done. Instead, he seemed different. He was offering help, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. But why? What could he possibly gain from aiding her, a royal alien princess? Kale, for his part, was struggling with his own set of questions. He had spent his entire life following orders, believing in the clear-cut lines of right and wrong. But the more he spoke to Gennara, the more he realized that things weren't so simple. She wasn't the enemy he had been taught to despise. Yes, she was the princess of the Valen Empire, but she was also a person, with fears, hopes, and desires, just like him. As he sat across from her, Cale found himself wondering how many other enemies like her he had fought, and whether he had ever really understood them at all. "I don't understand," Cale said finally, breaking the silence. "We're supposed to be enemies, yet here we are, sitting in the wreckage of your ship, talking like we're allies." He shook his head, not sure whether to laugh or be frustrated. "I've fought against your people for years. I've seen the destruction they've caused. But you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You're not what I thought you'd be." Gennara's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no anger in her expression, only a quiet, curious calm. She had always believed that humans were all the same, driven by violence and conquest. But here was Cale, a soldier who had seen war firsthand, yet he wasn't speaking with hatred or disdain. He was speaking with uncertainty. "We are who we are," Gennara replied softly. Her voice was steady, but there was a trace of something deeper beneath it, something that surprised even her. "I am a princess, yes, but that does not mean I do not feel. I am just a woman caught in the same war as you." Cale was silent for a moment, his gaze on the ground. Her words struck him harder than he had expected. He had always believed in the righteousness of his cause, the certainty that he was fighting for a greater good. But now, in the face of Gennara's calm honesty, he wasn't so sure anymore. He finally looked up at her, his blue eyes steady. "What if there is another way?" he asked, almost as if he were testing the question, not just on her, but on himself. "What if we could stop fighting? What if we could end this war?" Gennara stared at him, her mind racing. Could it be possible? Could a human soldier and a Valen princess really find common ground? Or was she simply dreaming of a peace that was too far out of reach? "I don't know," she said quietly, "but maybe, just maybe, we can try." For the first time, the walls she had built around herself began to feel a little less solid, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Cale, this human soldier, might just be the key to something she had never thought possible. The hours passed slowly as the two sat together in the ruins of the wrecked ship. The tension between Gennara and Cale had eased, but there was still an unspoken understanding that neither of them was fully sure of what came next. Gennara's body was weary from the battle, and though her pride kept her from showing any weakness, the injury she'd sustained earlier had begun to sting more sharply. Cale noticed the slight wince when she shifted her position and couldn't ignore the urge to help her, even though they were still, in theory, enemies. "Let me help with that," Cale said, his voice low but steady. Gennara looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly in suspicion. She had been trained to never accept help from an enemy, especially not a human. But there was something in Cale's demeanor, something that felt different from the soldiers she had encountered before. "I can manage," Gennara replied, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her words. She didn't want to be indebted to him, not after everything that had happened. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw no trace of deception. Cale wasn't looking at her like an enemy. He was looking at her as if she were a person in need, not a royal figure he was supposed to conquer. Cale didn't push the issue. Instead, he slowly withdrew a first aid kit from his pack, setting it between them. "At least let me clean the wound," he said, offering a small, tentative smile. Gennara hesitated, and for a moment, she considered refusing again. But as the pain from her injury grew more pronounced, she realized she had no choice. The wound needed attention, and if she wanted to survive long enough to return to her people, she couldn't afford to ignore it. With a quiet nod, Gennara allowed him to approach. Cale's hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the cut on her arm, his movements careful and precise. There was a focus to his touch that felt genuine, And for the first time since their encounter, Genera felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had always been the one to care for others, to lead with strength and poise. But in that moment, as Cal tended to her wound, she realized that maybe it wasn't so wrong to let someone else take care of her, even if just for a moment. "Thank you," Genera said quietly, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. She had never been one to show vulnerability, but Cal's kindness had softened something inside her. His actions had spoken louder than any words could, and she couldn't deny the shift in how she saw him. Cal looked up at her, surprised by the gratitude in her voice. He hadn't expected it, and it made him feel something he hadn't anticipated: connection. "You don't have to thank me," he replied, giving her a warm smile. "I'm just doing what anyone would do. You don't have to face this alone." Genera's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, she saw something in him, something human that she hadn't expected. Maybe Cal wasn't just another soldier caught in the machine of war. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for both of them to escape this cycle of destruction together. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Genera wasn't sure what the future held, or whether she could trust Cal completely. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to consider the idea of peace, not as a distant, impossible dream, but as something within reach. And in that moment, she realized that this human soldier, whose life had once seemed so separate from hers, had become someone she could no longer easily dismiss. The quiet that had settled between Cal and Genera was suddenly shattered by the distant roar of engines. Both their heads snapped up, instincts kicking in as they listened to the unmistakable sound of approaching ships. Genera's heart sank. She knew who it was. The deep rumble of the engines belonged to her people's elite soldiers, Valen warriors who had been sent to retrieve her. And if they had found her, they would stop at nothing to bring her back, whether she wanted to go or not. Cal's hand instinctively reached for his weapon, but then he stopped himself, his fingers tightening into a fist. He wasn't ready to fight, especially not over Genera. He had been trained to follow orders, to take down the enemy at all costs. But now, standing beside the Valen princess, he wasn't so sure. His loyalty was torn. He had already risked his life to help her, and the idea of fighting for her safety had become less about duty and more about something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Genera stood quickly, her eyes scanning the horizon. The ships were getting closer. There was no time to waste. "They're coming," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, though a hint of worry was evident in her tone. "You need to leave now. It's not safe here." Cal shook his head, his jaw set. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until I know you're safe." Genera stared at him, her mind racing. She knew that Cal's words weren't just bravado. He had proven himself in their time together, offering help, tending to her wound, and showing kindness when she least expected it. But she also knew that her enemies were ruthless. If Cal got caught in this, he wouldn't stand a chance, and that was something she couldn't allow to happen. "I don't have time to explain," Genera said, her voice low but firm. "You need to go. You can't be involved in this. They'll kill you." Cal looked at her, his blue eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, they both stood still, as if the world around them had frozen. He could see the pain in her eyes, the conflict between her duty to her people and the bond they had started to form. He understood it, perhaps more than he cared to admit. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't just walk away. Not when she needed him. Not now. "I'm staying," he said with quiet determination. "And I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Genera's gaze softened, though her fear remained. She had never expected this from a human soldier, let alone one who had so easily become entangled in her fate. But in this moment, there was no more room for doubt. She had spent too many years alone in her royal life, trusting only herself. And now, facing the threat of her own people, she realized how much she had longed for someone who might stand by her side. The sound of the ships grew louder, closer. There was no more time to argue. Genera grabbed Cal's arm, pulling him with her toward the cover of the nearby rocks. They both crouched low, hidden from view. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, but it wasn't a question. It was a quiet admission that, for the first time, she wasn't the only one with something to lose. Cale turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I'm with you, no matter what happens next." And for the first time since their meeting, Gennara didn't feel quite so alone. The wind howled around them, carrying the distant sounds of the Valen ships growing louder with every passing second. Gennara's heart pounded in her chest as she and Cale crouched behind the jagged rocks, doing their best to stay hidden. Her mind raced, calculating every possible escape route, every move they could make to avoid being caught. But with each passing moment, the reality of their situation grew clearer. They were trapped. Cale, however, didn't share her sense of panic. He sat beside her, his body tense but calm, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. He had fought in countless battles, but this was different. This wasn't a fight between soldiers or an ordered mission. It was about Gennara, and he had made a choice. He wasn't going to leave her, no matter what. Gennara glanced over at him, noticing the determination in his eyes. It was strange how much she had come to rely on him in such a short time. The war had taught her to trust only herself, to depend on her own strength and resolve. But now, with Cale at her side, she was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to trust someone else. As the ships grew closer, she felt a knot form in her stomach. She had been raised to be the leader of her people, to make decisions that would shape the future of the Valen Empire. But now, with her life on the line, and the lives of her people at risk, she wasn't sure what to do. Her heart told her to flee, to protect herself and escape with whatever strength she had left. But then she looked at Cale, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. "Cale," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "If we don't make it through this, if they capture me—" "Don't talk like that," Cale interrupted, his voice fierce. He leaned closer, his hand resting on hers for a brief moment, offering a small measure of comfort. "We're going to make it. I'm not leaving you." Gennara swallowed, trying to ignore the feeling of vulnerability that suddenly gripped her. She had never allowed anyone to get this close, never let her guard down enough to trust someone so fully. But Cale had proven himself over and over again. She had seen the way he cared for her, the way he stayed by her side despite the risks. And in that moment, she realized just how much she had come to rely on him. The sound of the ships grew deafening as they descended, their dark shapes silhouetted against the sky. Gennara could see them now, her people, their armor gleaming in the dimming light. They were here to bring her back, to force her into compliance with the war she had never fully agreed with. But as they landed, she felt no fear for herself. What frightened her most was the thought of Cale being caught in this mess, dragged into a war that wasn't his own. Cale stood up, his posture firm. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice steady. "We need to move. Now." Gennara looked up at him, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She didn't know what the future held, or whether they could escape. But for the first time, she wasn't facing it alone. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady, matching his determination. And together, they moved toward the uncertain future ahead. The chase had begun. Gennara and Cale moved swiftly through the dense forest, their bodies low to the ground, hearts pounding in their chests. The Valen ships hovered above them, their searchlights sweeping over the landscape in a pattern that grew closer with each passing minute. Gennara knew the terrain better than Cale, and she led the way, urging him to keep up with her pace. But Cale was no slouch. His military training had prepared him for many things, but this, running for their lives, was a new kind of challenge. He had always relied on strategy and combat to fight, but now his instincts and his trust in Gennara were the only things guiding him. "Stay close," Gennara whispered, glancing back at Cale. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension in her eyes. She knew they didn't have much time before the Valen soldiers closed in on them. Cale nodded, though his breath was ragged from the sprint. "I'm right behind you." They weaved through trees and rocks, Shannara using her knowledge of the land to find the best paths. She led them to a narrow ravine, hoping that the shadows would hide them long enough for the ships to pass. Shannara's mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't keep running forever. There had to be another way out. But what was it? The sound of the Valen ships grew louder, the whir of their engines reverberating in the air, and soon their bright lights pierced the darkness, sweeping over the ravine where the two had taken cover. Shannara pressed herself against the cold stone, her breath held, praying that they wouldn't be found. Kale stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, but he didn't make a move. He didn't need to. He was waiting for the right moment, waiting for Shannara's lead. The ships hovered just above them, casting long shadows over the ravine. Shannara's pulse quickened. If they found them here, there would be no escape. She was trapped, and so was Kale. Her mind spun as she scanned the surroundings, looking for a way out, any opening they could slip through. And then, just as the ships seemed to be closing in, Shannara noticed something. A narrow, barely visible passageway at the far end of the ravine, hidden by thick underbrush. Without thinking, she grabbed Cal's arm and pulled him toward it. "Move," she urged, her voice sharp with urgency. Cale didn't question her, his instincts kicking in. They dashed for the narrow gap in the rocks, slipping through the dense undergrowth and into the hidden passage. The Valen ships continued to search, unaware that the two had escaped. They ran deeper into the passage, the walls tight on either side, forcing them to move at a slower pace. Cal's breathing was heavy, but he kept his focus. Shannara, too, was silent, her thoughts racing. They had bought themselves a little time, but how much longer could they keep running? Her royal training had taught her how to lead her people in battle, but now, leading them to safety was a whole new kind of challenge, and though she had always been the one to guide others, for the first time, she felt the weight of the responsibility that Cal had placed on her. Together, they moved through the darkness, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side.